A few days ago, I published an episode on protein. What's the healthiest form? What's the best form for building muscle? And as part of that episode, I included 7 minutes of an interview I did with one of the world's experts on protein metabolism and muscle synthesis. He's from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, Hamilton Roschel. And the problem with a 7-minute interview is you take so much out of context and you lose so much detail. And people found the interview so fascinating, I said I would post the whole 1 hour that we talked. And so here you go. Hello, Hamilton.
Hi, Chris.
Oh, thanks for joining. I know you're super busy.
Thank you for having me.
I can't imagine what it's like to run a lab like yours.
Yeah, it's a whole bunch of people because now we have there are two of us coordinating the lab, like head of the labs, me and Dr. Bruno Gualano, and below us we managed to incorporate a number of former postdoc of ours that we managed to incorporate as associate researchers. They have their own grant, they have their own students, so we make up to almost like 70 students in the lab, 70 people in the
Wow,
lab between
amazing.
researchers, postdocs, PhDs, undergraduates. It's quite a big setup, so it's quite a bit of work too, but it's fun.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's how many publications? It's over 200.
A bit over 200 now, for myself individually. As a group, I can't even count. It's just so many because there's so many people working together. So we do produce quite a lot of data throughout the year. Last year was especially uh, productive. Some of our research regarding the COVID was published throughout last year. So last year will be about like almost 40 papers, which is insane. Yeah. It's not normal. It's not like it's not even adequate because it all needs to be very looked upon, right? You need to supervise everything, all aspects of data collection until final publication. So it was a very busy week, but we didn't stop. The lab kept on running during the pandemic because we're inside the hospital, the university hospital, the School of Medicine. So the activities there continued, and we took advantage of the fact that most of the hospital during the pandemic, during 2020 especially, was dedicated to COVID patients. It's the biggest hospital in Latin America, so it's quite big, and most of it was dedicated to COVID patients because we had it pretty bad down here. And so we took advantage of the fact that we had the patients right next door, so we collect a whole bunch of data on them.
Yeah, and before that, you had a paper that got quite a bit of attention. That's one of the ones I wanted to ask you about. It's your paper on the high protein plant-based diet versus.
Oh, okay,
Can you describe that study?
sure.
Half of them were omnivores, the other half habitual
That was
vegans.
such a fun study to run. I've myself have always been interested in protein metabolism. We've been collaborating with Stu Phillips since like 2013 or something, 2012, in different studies, and protein metabolism has always been a field of interest of mine. And this was especially interesting because the whole literature on the effects of protein source on muscle anabolism.
I'll cut in here for just a second to make sure we all understand the word anabolism because I was a little fuzzy on it. There's a definition in biology which includes building up large complex molecules from simple ones, such as amino acids, to muscles.
Was really about acute studies or sometimes chronic studies.
So I looked up the definition of acute too to make sure I really understood that. And in a paper on muscle synthesis, they said it's a response between several hours and 24 hours to training stimulus or nutritional stimulus like a protein shake, whereas chronic is long term.
The whole literature on the effects of protein source on muscle anabolism was really about acute studies or sometimes chronic studies, but with the protein source being factored in the study as a supplementary protein to a mixed diet. And what we wanted to see actually was, okay, so if you supplement different sources of protein, you might not get a difference in the effect, in the chronic effect of resistance training, let's say. But what about if you're comparing like exclusively plant-based protein sources against mostly animals protein sources in a mixed diet? So we designed this study using vegans as a model for exclusive plant-based eaters, of course. And we wanted to make a fair comparison because almost as default is not really a rule, but as an average, the vegan diet tends to be a little bit lower on protein content. Uh, of course, you have vegans who are very knowledgeable about their diets, and they do manage to get high protein diets only with whole foods and special preparations and everything. But on average, it tends to be a little bit lower. So we didn't want to compare different protein amounts in their diets. We wanted to compare only the source. So we have to make protein intake even between the two groups, and both groups were taking protein below the recommendation when you start resistance training. So you have a lot of data on this right now, and we have a break point of protein intake and the effects on gains in muscle mass and strength.
And that's 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight.
Exactly. 1.6 grams per kg body mass. So what we did is we really assessed people's protein intake from both groups, so we would understand what the variation would be in their daily protein intakes, so we could individually tailor supplementation to each of the subject. For the vegans, with a plant-based protein, a soy isolate protein; to the omnivores, whey protein, of course, animal derived protein. So they would all eat 1.6 grams per kg body mass throughout the whole study. So that was our design, and that's what we did. We're very successful in doing that. Actually, all the groups ate 1.7 throughout the entire study. And we did muscle assessments of different levels, if you want to call that. We had a more a macroscopic assessment with DEXA scans, so we would assess lean mass on these subjects. We also assessed muscle cross-sectional area via ultrasound imaging. So we take images of the muscle with the ultrasound equipment, and we can calculate what the cross-sectional area is. And we went a little deeper, and it took muscle biopsies, and we also measured the muscle fiber area of these subjects. So we had these assessments, of course, pre and post intervention. They trained with us under our supervision for 12 weeks. We did some muscle function assessments too, 1RM, this sort of stuff, maximum repetition tests for muscle strength. And we managed to select individuals with very similar characteristics, because we were afraid that one of the criticism we might get in our studies that, okay, so we took vegans against omnivores, but usually vegans are more aware of other life habits that usually are not present in omnivores. So they will be more physically active, they might be leaner, they might have whatever other aspect of their life that is better than the omnivore. So that's why you got the results that you got. So we tried to level off the groups in all of those aspects. So they were equally strong, they were equally lean, they have similar muscle masses, lean masses, and they have similar physical activity levels. We did some blood assessments as well to check for usual parameters that are observed in this type of study. And then we started the intervention with the diet monitoring, the supplement intake, and the training. After the 12 weeks of training, we did the whole assessments again, and not really a surprise. The results were exactly this, not exactly the same. That's wrong to say when you're talking science. They were very comparable between the two groups. There were no differences between the increments in muscle mass and strength that we observed in both groups. So they were we equally stronger after the intervention. They got more lean mass, they got more muscle cross-sectional area, they got more muscle fiber cross-sectional area in a similar fashion between the omnivores and the vegans. And the conclusion that we took from the study is that given that you take enough protein, that your protein intake is adequate when you're resistance training, the protein source wouldn't play a role in the adaptations to resistance training in young, healthy individuals. Of course, you cannot extrapolate this to other populations, but to the one that we study, yes, we were able to conclude that. So it was a very fun study because we know we would get people mad at us no matter what the results were. If we found that they were equally effective, people would cry about that animal protein is better. If we got the other way around, people would say that you were wrong. Vegan diet is just as good. So we were really at peace with whatever came out of the results. I was particularly happy with the results because this was our even though that's not what we declared, what we state in the introduction of the paper, because we had to be loyal to what is the available literature. We didn't really think there would be a difference because amino acids are amino acids, and we really don't care where they come from. As long as you're taking enough of them, you should be fine, and that's what we found. So
But wasn't your hypothesis going in that the omnivores would probably do a little better on whey protein than the vegans on soy protein?
we had to base our hypothesis on the available literature again, and the available literature was mostly on acute studies. And whenever you take a acute study and you compare protein per protein, animal versus plant-based protein, the animal protein will always do better in stimulating muscle protein synthesis than the plant-based protein. But that's when you compare one isolate protein with the other. What we're doing when you assess in a vegan diet is that you get a mixed meal, right? So you have a whole bunch of different foods plus the supplement. So you're bound to get a better protein than if you're comparing just one food in isolation. So that's why we think we got the result that we got. Because the literature is pretty clear. Protein per protein, the animal protein will perform better, but that's not how diet goes, right? You don't eat one food per time. You eat a mixed meal, and these studies are awesome in letting us understand what the physiology of nutrition is, but they don't translate into dieting studies and this sort of stuff. So that's why our study is so important, we think.
Was the concern that the amino acid leucine is generally found in lower amounts as a percentage in plant foods than in animal foods, and that's the trigger?
Yes, that is the trigger. That could be a concern, but it is important for whoever is listening to us to understand that these leucine trigger hypothesis is based on an effect that is saturable. So it's not like the more leucine you take, the greater muscle protein synthetic response you get. There's a threshold to that. And if you look at our paper, if you look at one of the tables, I don't recall by heart what table number that is, the one with the diet data, you see that the leucine intake was lower in the vegan group than it was in the omnivore group. It was like 9 grams, and omnivore was like 11, something like that, if I recall correctly. What we take from that is that considering that is a saturable phenomenon, the amount of leucine that the vegan group got would be enough to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis, and taking more than that wouldn't help further. So that would be one of the explanations. We also have another paper that from a year before, with just leucine supplementation. I don't know if you saw that paper. What we did in that one is that it was only omnivores, right? But they were all taking 1.6 grams per kg body mass in their usual diet, no supplements involved. And we supplemented one group with leucine and the other with placebo. And we did quite a bit of leucine. We gave quite a bit of leucine to the leucine supplemented groups, like 10 grams a day, 2 5-gram doses. And we didn't see any difference in adaptation to resistance training. Why is that if leucine is such an important amino acid? When you're taking enough protein in your diet, you're already taking enough leucine, and leucine is already doing the job it's doing. If you give a whole bunch more leucine, it's not going to do an additional job because it's a saturable phenomenon each time you take leucine. So if I'll make up values, they're not real. But if you were to have breakfast, because I know it's early where you are right now, and you take like 10 grams of leucine or 5 grams of leucine, the amount of muscle protein synthesis stimulation that you get would be similar. So there's a saturable pattern in muscle protein synthetic response to leucine intake. So that's why we think that the vegan group was already having enough. That's why this difference in leucine intake wasn't important. And then again, if you start mixing foods, you're bound to get the correct amount of leucine, right? I mean, it would be very wrong to assume that a very steady diet, steady vegan diet would be a correct approach, as it wouldn't be correct if you're an omnivore too. I always kid about that. You can always be vegan by eating French fries and drinking Coke. You're still vegan, but you're not a good one. Right? So it's the variety, it's the mixed foods that you get, is the mixing of the foods, and that is the beautiful thing in a vegan diet. That's why it's so versatile, and that's why you get so much nutrients out of it.
So I wanted to ask you about a chart that you posted on Instagram from a paper that Luc van Loon published fairly recently. And it's this one. It just shows that according to the type of food, the whole food, you know, definitely fish and steaks have the highest protein content per calorie. And then soy and peas are next, but you go all the way up to oats and quinoa, brown rice and potatoes, and you got to eat a lot of that, you know, to get those proteins. And in that paper, the investigators said there's also a change in the amino acid profile. They become a little less favorable, and then you have the interference from fiber and tannins, you know, for absorbability and so on. So in your study, I don't know what the vegans were eating, but they were getting soy protein, you know, on top of it as a supplement. If they weren't getting that soy protein and they were more on the edge of quinoa and oats, I know you don't have the data. Any speculation, any hypothesis about what would happen?
I have a few considerations about the chart that you just showed. It's a beautiful piece of paper. Luc van Loon does a great job. Him and his group does marvelous work. But you have to understand that the chart is considering like isolate foods again, and that's not how we eat, right? That might be how you eat an omnivore diet, how you get animal protein in your diet. You do get a big piece of steak, you do get a serving of fish or chicken or whatever, but not when you're, again, a good vegan, right? You try and try to get mixed types of foods. You do a whole bunch of different combinations in order to get the amount of amino acids and the combination of amino acids that would really favor you. And Here in Brazil, especially, but if you look throughout the world, you also get the same idea. Um, into sort of, I would say it's out of intuition, but we evolved to provide the mixing of the foods that would be adequate for us. So here in Brazil, the special or the all-time favorite, whatever you go, you're gonna get is rice and beans, right? That's our signature meal in Brazil, rice and beans. I know it's a different, it's a little bit different depending on where you go, but you always get cereals and legumes and beans of some sort that are combined. And this combination seems to be a pretty good one. The lysine and the methionine, and they lack in one but not in the other. They're present in the other but not in this one. So you combine it and you get the whole package. And now we know why, right? But when we start doing that, I don't know how many years ago, of course we didn't know that, but that's why I said it's probably out of intuition, our ancestors, I would say. So the chart doesn't take that into consideration. When you say you need to get like 2 kilos of banana to get 30 grams of protein, of course you're not suggesting that you should get your protein out of bananas. But it's just to say that animal proteins are more protein dense than plant foods. That's a given. We all know that. It's not a new fact, but it's something to take into consideration when you're planning a vegan diet, especially if you're concerned about the protein content in that diet. To provide the adequate combinations is a must. So you have to think about it. You have to, for those who are not very knowledgeable on this, they should ask for professional help, and they could make a dietary plan that would meet all your requirements. And this sort of combination supposedly would take care of providing all of the amino acids in a proper amount that you might need if you're training. But then again, I don't see nothing wrong with supplementing a good plant-based protein if you're in need to, if you need to complement your diet in some way, because we do that every day with Omnivores. And nobody ever complained about it, right? You see people taking whey protein as if it was like water. You go to a gym, it's hard to find someone who's not taking a protein powder. Usually dairy-derived protein powder. Why not do that with the vegans as well if you need to complement their diet with a little bit of protein? So I don't see nothing wrong with that. In our study, there wasn't. We didn't plan for that. We didn't plan to account for what the whole food intake combination was. So we couldn't go through the data and redo that. Would be quite a bit of work, but we could do that because we had the data. But we didn't do that calculation. We do know how much they were taking from diet. You do know how much you had to give them in order to reach the 1.6. And what we did with the Omnivores is that we calculate how much of the protein they were taking from animal sources in their whole food diet. So when you add that to the whey protein that we gave them, that would make up to about 80% of their protein from animal sources. Whilst of course the vegan would be 100% from plant-based sources.
So one of the takeaways I took, it's a little bit of a hunch, but lean into legumes like the Brazilians do. There's so many other studies where for longevity and so on, legumes seem to be a really big factor in the whole thing. For endurance athletes, so I do triathlons, Ironman triathlons, so we get 1.6 grams of protein per kilo easily because we burn so many calories running and biking. We eat more and we're usually fewer kilos in weight anyway. So totally anecdotally, but my friends and I experimented with different protein powders and we could not tell any difference in performance. It would just, maybe because we're getting adequate protein, I don't know. It'd be an interesting experiment. I know that's not the one you did, but But that does bring me to another study you did for the elderly that was published fairly recently. You sent me that paper, and it was quite fascinating because it looked like they were getting, so these are people on the either pre-frailty or frail people. I guess there's,
Yes.
you referenced a definition for that. And and they were getting about 0.8 grams per kilo of protein. So you put them on various different supplement regimens, whey protein, leucine, soy protein, and so on, and also resistance exercise. And it seemed like the only thing that mattered was the resistance exercise. Supplementation didn't seem to do anything.
Yeah. I'll before I get to that, let me just make an additional point in the previous answer, because I know you mentioned about the anti-nutrients that might be present in some of the plant foods that might hamper some of the absorption of protein. That is a fact, of course, but that can be circumvented by simple procedures like I don't know how you call that in English, but when you soak them in water overnight. Simple procedures like that would really lower the content of anti-nutrients. They're going to still be there, but in a very small amount. That would help also with gas formation and gastrointestinal discomfort that some might get when trying to move towards a more plant-based diet. So I forgot to mention that earlier. But yeah, that could be an issue if you're trying to get a whole bunch of food, a whole bunch of protein. Since plant-based plant-derived foods are lower in protein or are less dense in protein, you might need more food. And when you get more food, you get more everything. You get more calories, you get more carbohydrates, you get more fiber, which is good, but in excess could be a problem. You get more anti-nutrients. So you have to take into consideration all that when you're doing a dietary plan that involves mostly plant-based foods or entirely a plant-based diet. But this can all be taken care of. This isn't an impairment to a vegan diet, of course. It just needs to be taken into consideration, and the necessary precautions need to be put in action. But getting to the point, the other study, yes, we had 4 different studies within the large trial, and they all seem to come back with the same result. Exercise was the king, while whatever supplementary strategy that we tried failed to enhance the anabolic effects of training to these elderly individuals. And the elderly present with a very specific condition. It's called the anabolic resistance. And anabolic resistance, to be very straight to the point, is a lower response or a hampered response to an anabolic stimulus. If you compare the same anabolic stimulus, either exercise or protein intake, between a young and an older individual, their response, the response for the older individual is lower than that of the younger one. So you have different ways to approach this. You either maximize the stimulus in order to try and get them up to the same level of response than you get to a younger one, or you assume that they don't respond. So what we did in our study is that we had one of the specific sub-study that you mentioned. We had 3 groups. We had a placebo group, we had a whey protein supplemented group, and we had a soy isolate supplemented group. For the placebo, of course, they stay with the 0.8 grams per kg body mass a day of protein intake. The other 2, they went up to 1.2 grams per kg body mass. After 4 months of training, they all got stronger. They all got better functionality scores. They all got more muscle, more lean mass, and more muscle cross-sectional area. but they got it all in an equal manner, including the placebo. That's why we say that the supplement or supplementing protein to these individuals didn't work. But I still think that it didn't work because of two things. We didn't give them enough protein. Since they have the anabolic resistance, they would need more than the 1.2 that we managed to get them. And the fact that they're pre-frail and frail might enhance even further the anabolic resistance that they present. And there is this meta regression data in the literature that says that shows quite clearly that the effect of protein supplementation is less when you're older than when you're younger to muscle mass accrual. Still there, but much more subtle. But when you think of clinical relevance, the clinical relevance to an older individual is much greater than that to a younger one, unless you're thinking of sports or high performance athletes. To a normal individual, of course, you want to maximize gains, but the amount of extra muscle that you get when you provide more protein in their diet is not really that clinically relevant as it is to an older individual to perhaps not gain additional muscle, but to stop losing muscle, right? Mm-hmm. So I still think that protein, dietary protein, is one of the major strategies to mitigate age-related muscle loss. But we have quite a bit of conundrum here because protein is also very satiating. And especially to the older individual who's already eating less. It's one of the features of getting older. You start eating less, you have less appetite when you're older, generally, right? Of course, there are exceptions, but in general, you tend to eat less, and you tend to eat less protein, especially because of dyspepsia and the difficulty of digesting protein. So, or if you think of animal protein, some teeth problems might become a problem for you to chew on a big chunk of meat. So in general, you eat less and you eat less protein. So you need to get to increment these people diet with more protein. But what is the difficulty here? When you give them protein in between meals, you get a satiety effect that might make them eat less in the upcoming meal. So you might end up at the end of the day with a lower protein or lower energy intake than expected. And the same would be if you try to increment a lower protein containing meal with additional protein like supplement, as we did in our study. So we took breakfast and dinner, which are the lowest protein containing meal here in Brazil. I know for you guys, dinner is the biggest meal. For us, it's lunch. Mm-hmm. So breakfast and dinner will be the lowest protein containing meal. We had that data before, so that's why we gave them 15 grams of additional protein, either via whey or soy protein in the breakfast, and the same at dinner. What the thing is, if you do it as a complement to a meal, it still might be pretty satiating, and you eat less throughout the day. If you do it between meals, it can also be satiating enough, and the upcoming meal will be compromised in terms of calories and nutrients, and including protein. So it's a pretty big paradox. We know they need more protein, but it's hard to get them to eat more protein. If you do it with supplement, you get the effect that I'm telling you. If you do it with food, you have the other complications that are already mentioned. So one of the factors that we consider in our study is that we might have not given them enough protein. That's one thing. And the other would be to give them enough protein would be pretty hard. To give them like 1.5, 1.6 or 2 grams per kg body mass. Would be pretty hard. We're working on that in 2 different scenarios currently with older individuals. One is with sarco-obese elderly. So they have
sarco-obese elderly.
Yeah, they
What
have
does that mean?
sarcopenia and they're obese at the same time.
Oh.
So you have sort of like a perfect storm here, right? Because you get all the bad things that you get from obesity, and you get all the bad things that you get from sarcopenia. So we're trying to tackle this with slightly lower, slightly energy deficient diet. You cannot be really aggressive with older people in that aspect, especially with sarcopenic older people, because you might compromise muscle mass. But we're at the same time increasing protein intake and resistance training these individuals. So we're trying to get their weight a little bit down while we maintain or even get a little bit of muscle to these guys throughout the course of a 4-month intervention. And the other study that we're working on is with elderly admitted in our hospital in the geriatrics ward. So we have a whole bunch of different eligibility criteria, but they're in bed rest, they're losing muscle like this, and we're trying to provide an intervention with protein intake and neuromuscular stimulation in bed, because they cannot deambulate much. So what we're thinking is in more extreme situations, even if we don't get that 1.6 grams per kg body mass, we might still get a benefit from protein intake, from protein manipulation in their diet regarding the preservation of muscle. But that will be more extreme conditions, you know.
That triggers a couple of questions in my mind. One is, I heard Luc Van Loon give a talk, and he said, you would think that the decline in muscle mass and strength would be linear. It would go like that. But he said, what we actually observe in people is more of a stepwise function, because about every 10 years, maybe, they have something that confines them to bed rest for a week. It's, you know, a serious illness, a surgery or something like that. And during that week or two or whatever it is, there's catastrophic muscle loss, and they never regain it. They can regain maybe half of it, but as they get older, it never comes back. You have to maintain it, use it, or lose it. Can you comment on that?
He's absolutely correct, and we saw that. We have data on that as well. What happens is that these unexpected events, they exacerbate muscle loss in these individuals. So everyone has a story of a relative or someone's grandmother, grandfather who was really doing well, but had a fall, broke his or her hip, had to go under surgery, had a pretty big loss, never came back from it. It was sort of trivial situation. It was just a bone fracture, but that triggered a very exacerbated muscle loss, and that really took a hard hit on the subject. Or a relative who's doing well, he had like pneumonia, had to be in bed rest for a couple of weeks, never came back from it. Those are common stories, unfortunately. So yes, these events might exacerbate muscle loss quite a bit, and it's very hard unless you be really aggressive and be really early on intervening with these subjects. You might not get that muscle back and that function back, and that snowballs in a vicious circle of inactivity and exacerbation of muscle loss, and more inactivity and more muscle loss, and triggering chronic conditions, and that takes away the health of these individuals. So it's pretty common. We saw that during the pandemic. So I was telling you before, we managed to collect data straight from the hospital where the most of the COVID patients were admitted here in São Paulo. And what we did, it's a 2-step study. We assessed these individuals upon admission with COVID infection, SARS-CoV-2 infection, actually. We assessed muscle cross-sectional area and muscle function, hand grip strength. And we assessed them back again when they were discharged from hospital. So the first study was to look at if your muscle health, I'm sort of like being general on this, if the amount of muscle and the amount of strength that you have upon admission could predict how much you would stay in hospital. And as a matter of fact, it did. Those who had better muscle health, who were stronger and had more muscle, tended to stay less days in hospital than the weaker and with less muscle ones. Was I clear on this?
Yeah, that's quite
Sorry,
interesting.
I'm
So
trying
that's
to
sort of
work
like-
my English here.
No, your English is great. So it's sort of like being young and fit. You try to, I mean, I'm in that elderly group that was in your study, and I don't think I have any of these problems. I mean,
Definitely not. Definitely not. When we're talking about frail elderly, they're really compromised. And
yeah.
this study that I'm telling you about, the one with the COVID, we corrected for all of the confounding factors, and still those who were weaker and had less muscle tended to stay longer in the hospital. And then the second part of the study was we also assessed them at discharge, and we tried to look at how much muscle and strength they lost in these 10 days of hospitalization. And it was like absurd. A whole bunch of muscle, a whole bunch of muscle function, and some of them will never come back from it.
Oh, no.
And we're following these guys 6 months after discharge. And what we are seeing is that those who lost the most during hospitalization are the ones spending more with health during the 6 months after discharge. So it has repercussion on your life afterwards. So it's really important to preserve muscle mass in this population, and to go at it when you have an event like that, hospitalization of any sort, to try and mitigate to the most the amount of muscle function that you lose is key.
So if you're a patient in the hospital and you're trying to recover from, I guess it will depend on the disease, but I mean, like when I fly on an airplane, I do push-ups in the aisle, and I get up and walk every hour and all that. I have never, once I had a serious flu when I was in my 30s. That was the only week I didn't exercise. And maybe that's why I haven't lost as much. You know, I still can go out and run and bike and all that kind of stuff. But if you're a patient in a hospital, do you have some advice on what to do to avoid this catastrophe?
That's one of the investigations we're running right now, as I told you, with the neuromuscular stimulation and the protein supplementation in bed. And that would be our go-to therapies. Actually, you need to exercise. If you're not able, nowadays there are this apparatus that you can bring on bedside, and you can exercise a little bit. If the patient is functioning, he can get up from bed. You can provide some forms of weight-based exercise, their body weight exercises actually, but to move is fundamental. To have some sort of mechanical load on your skeleton, to have some mechanical load on your muscles is key, right? And you just have to find what it is that you're able to do in these specific conditions. Not all conditions would allow you to get up from bed and do body weight exercises. But some of them would allow you to go on bedside and do some NMS, some neuromuscular stimulation. Some conditions would allow you to put these equipment, and you could sort of like cycle both upper and lower limb ergometers while in bed, and to provide what you need in order to mitigate muscle loss, which fundamentally would be protein. But not all conditions would also allow for that. So it's hard to generalize, but the go-to therapies would be protein and exercise, actually.
You know, you remind me a little bit, when I was a young teen, I used to caddy for Jack LaLanne. He was like the Arnold Schwarzenegger of his day, and he was a great hero of mine. And he was always lecturing me about diet. You know, when the golfers were supposed to buy their caddies a treat at the 11th hole at the snack shop they had there, and all the other caddies would get Butterfinger bars and, you know, candy, and he would only allow me peanuts or raisins. And he said a couple of things. He said exercise is king and diet is queen, and together you have a kingdom. But people who have poor diets and exercise can look great, but people who have a great diet and no exercise, they look terrible.
Yeah.
And so it feels like, you know, all the protein in the world isn't going to do any good unless you move.
Yes. Jack LaLanne has this iconic saying, and it's really true. And Stu Phillips, he has a paper that he titled, "You Can't Outrun a Bad Diet." So if you, these two concepts that you're just saying, and they're very true. You cannot leave out of McDonald's and still think you can outrun it. But exercise, if you look at the potency of these interventions in isolation, I would say that exercise it's bound to affect you more dramatically in a positive way, I would say. And to be sedentary will also affect you in a bad way pretty hard as well. So,
catastrophically.
Yeah. So yeah.
I had a second question too. When you were talking about the elderly and they lose their appetite, especially when you give them some protein supplements and all that, might that be a huge factor in just getting them to get out and walk? You know, go walk a few miles. It stimulates the appetite a little bit because you burn 100 calories a mile you walk or something like that. And so maybe they're not stressing the muscles all that much, but at least they're going to compensate by intaking a little more protein, maybe?
It's hard to say because appetite regulation it isn't really as straightforward as this. You might get different results out of this. There are data to say that regular exercise might diminish your non-exercise activities throughout the day. You probably heard of that. If you have that, for people who has that scheduled hour of the day to really exercise, some of them compensate by not moving as much throughout the day. So it's hard to really put a finger on what would happen in this case. If it's really guided and if you have proper support, that might be a good alternative to induce food intake. But then you get those people who are who compensate in eating, right? So I exercised, so I'm allowed to eat my Butterfinger, as you just said. I'm not saying that's the case with the elderly, but you know where I'm getting to with this. Unless you're really guided in what is this for, it might backfire. That's what I'm saying.
I see. Yeah, that's interesting because when I was training for triathlon, all the coaches would warn us, just because you went on a 3-hour bike ride or a 2-hour run doesn't mean you can sit around all day. You got to keep moving. You got to keep the blood circulating for recovery, and you're going to negate the effects of the exercise by sitting. You know, so
Perfect.
I almost sometimes every time I talk on the phone, I'm walking, and when I film my episodes, I'm walking, and so on. I almost did that with you, but it's dark outside because it's early in the morning. We have pretty good bandwidth around here, so I can, you know, hold a camera out and connect to the internet and walk while we talk. But so let's see what other kind of questions I have. Do you think because your vegans in that young man study were Brazilian and they ate a lot of rice and beans, that's part of the reason that the vegans came out so favorably against the omnivores, or is it just too hard to say?
I wouldn't assume that, to be very honest. I'll say this, assuming that you're dealing with, I'll code this again, the good vegans, the results might be the same anywhere you go. If you're doing good choices while being vegan, if you're doing good food combinations, I don't see why you would have a problem. And I've talked to this, I've talked to Simon Hill about this a little bit.
That was a great interview. I love that.
Yeah, he has great content, and he has great everyday solutions for people who are trying to be vegan or to be more plant-based. Great recipes, great simple information for all types of audience. So there's really good information out there for those who are seeking for a plant-based diet or a more plant-based diet. And people like Simon does an awesome job in providing information for general audience. You do it as well with your YouTube channel. So people should look for these guys who are doing serious and scientific based information for those who are seeking for better health. And I wouldn't say that being a Brazilian would automatically imply that you're a good vegan. Not by far. We do eat rice and beans, but that might not be a rule to all the vegans that we got in our group. We do have that data. We didn't go through it in that sense, but it would be fun to revisit that. If we do, I'll give you a call when we talk further about this. But
Yeah,
definitely, I think
great.
if you're again a good vegan would have the same results anywhere.
So there was another Jack LaLanne story that that I thought was interesting. He would tell me on the golf course, Chris, if it came from a cow or a pig, don't eat it. He said, you won't miss it. And it's like, what do you mean I won't miss it? It's delicious. My dad barbecues steak out in the back, and now I don't eat it and I don't miss it. But back then, as a teenager, I couldn't imagine. But I was looking at this guy thinking, how could he be that strong and that ripped? I mean, these one-handed handstands he could do on somebody, and the unbelievable physique. And he had given up eating anything from a cow or a pig, so mainly for him it was poultry, fish, and vegetables and fruit. And he told me, I want you to eat 10 vegetables. It sounded terrible at the time, but I've developed a taste for them. I want you to eat 10 vegetables and 5 fruits every day. Concentrate on it. And he said vegetables were pretty high in protein. I mean, some of that stuff that he said back then just seems so relevant today. Do you have any sense for, if you're an omnivore, beef protein versus chicken versus fish? I mean, health outcomes are quite different. But in terms of athletic performance, building muscle and all that kind of stuff, is there any difference?
It shouldn't be. As it wouldn't. I always say, because I don't know if it's a little bit off topic, and if it is, please set me straight. But people tend to say that, or used to say that, being a vegan would make up for a better diet for performance, or being an omnivore would make up for a better diet for performance. And what all these years of study had got me to is that a good vegan diet and a good omnivore diet, because there are good omnivore diets, of course. There are very bad omnivore diets. A good omnivore diet and a good vegan diet, they shouldn't differ much in most aspects. It's when you get a whole bunch of red meat, you get a whole bunch of heterocycle amines, is when you get a whole bunch of saturated fat, then you get in a bad omnivore diet. It's when you, being an omnivore and at the same time you neglect fruits and legumes and vegetables, that's when you're being a bad omnivore. To be a bad vegan is when you don't get a diversity. That is the whole beauty of being a vegan. When you have a very steady diet while vegan, that's when you're not a good vegan. That's when you're a Diet Coke and French fried vegan. So you can be bad at both ends, right? But very good vegan diet and a very good omnivore diet, they tend to be the same for most aspects of your life, including performance. So it wouldn't really matter if you're getting your protein from fish or from red meat, in reasonable amounts, of course, right? As it wouldn't matter if you're getting from rice and legumes as well. As long as you get enough and you get all the amino acids that you need, you'll be fine.
Yeah, every now and then I see an athlete like Megan Duhamel, speaking of Canada, Megan Duhamel was a figure skater, and she just went completely vegan in the midst of, training for the Olympics and everything. And she said, I didn't care if it affected I wanted it to not affect my performance, but my priorities were, I'm going vegan for animal, reasons, ethical reasons. And so she did it, and she won a gold medal. And she said, I don't think I noticed any difference in, being a good omnivore, being a good vegan. Either one, you can be a great athlete. So
Yeah, definitely,
so
definitely, and that's why I think that documentary that got so much hype a few months back or
Game
a year
Changers.
and something like Game Changers is so bad. It was really a bad service to the vegan community because it makes all the wrong arguments, right? In my opinion, you make all the wrong arguments. Being vegan is awesome. It's great. There's no debate on how good it is to be more plant-based oriented in your diet. If you go full plant-based, even better. There's no argument against it. But to argue that it's better than being a good omnivore, that's just pushing it too hard, and there's no science to back that up. And the arguments that they make in the documentary are just so wrong, with the wrong references, with the wrong data. So, again, when you think of health, there's a very good case for vegan or for vegetarian diet. There's no dispute about this. So when you go performance, even though we didn't assess elite athletes, there's no reason to think that there's any to be lost by going vegan. And is there something to be gained by going vegan? Yes, if you're a bad omnivore, definitely there's something to be gained. But there'll be something to be gained to become a good omnivore if you're a bad one. So that's where the comparisons are really, there's a very thin line there.
Well, I've kept you for an hour, and I so appreciate it. I know how busy you are. Sorry I pestered you for so long. But you're so fascinating, and your studies are so fascinating. I just felt like I couldn't let it go. So, yeah. So what's, are there any exciting, I'm sure there are exciting studies you're working on. I don't know if you can talk about any of them and what you're looking at now, your research interests.
Yes, we're really interested in running the same study that we did with the young individuals with older individuals. Because of the anabolic resistance, people are always talking about, but what if it were older individuals? Would still a vegan diet be enough to support muscle anabolism while resistance training these individuals? That is a very good question because of the anabolic resistant aspect of aging. And that is the study that we're trying to run. It's very difficult to run these type of studies, especially with the older population. There are quite a few studies running right now. The one with the older people with sarcopenic obesity, it's a study of great relevance, we think, because this population is growing, especially in North America, at a very high rate. Now you find much more obese and sarcopenic older individuals than you did in past time, and supposedly we might get this even more exacerbated after the pandemic because of all the restrictions. So people move even less, so they bound to lose muscle and gain weight. So that might be an issue in the upcoming years. And especially with the vegan aspect, we're doing this with the elderly, as I told you, and we're doing some studies to understand why people become vegan. If it has something to do with the specific knowledge on nutrition and health that they have, if it's more on the ethical aspect, and how does this play a role in them being vegan in the quality of their diet. It's this has become a very interesting topic for me, because I myself and I'm moving towards a more plant-based diet. I'm making this transition, if you want to call it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I would be one of those carnivores with the bone in your hand, like chewing on the bone, like crazy amounts of meat. And I don't remember the last time I ate red meat, so I think I'm doing a good job on this. I still eat dairy products, every now and then eggs, but I'm slowly moving towards a more plant-based diet and try to understand this further. Is becoming a matter of interest, of personal interest too. So we
I
bound to
just
do
did
more things on this.
I just did an episode on iron. Part of it was iron deficiency anemia for premenstrual women mainly who suffer from it. But then iron overload for postmenopausal women and men, and especially among people who eat a lot of red meat because of the high concentration of heme iron in there. That the body can't upregulate the absorption, and the body doesn't really have a way to get rid of it and so on, unless you get blood and so on. And yeah, chicken and fish have some heme iron, but not, to the same extent that, all the red meat has. And that seems to, have a pretty dramatic impact. When you said you could be a bad omnivore and eat a lot of red meat, I agree with that. Just to give you my background, I'm an earth scientist by background, and so, I was in earth science starting in the 70s. And just looking at the animal agriculture problem, it was a really big problem. Disposal of manure and the antibiotics and everything else that goes into it. But especially with cattle, raising cattle, they just take so much water and so much land unless you really concentrate them. And even then, you can't concentrate them like you can chickens or something like that. And so we're deforesting the rainforest down where you are to provide feed for animals and also pastures for cows and so on. So for me, a big motivation for going vegan was being an earth scientist. A lot of us as earth scientists see what's happening to the earth and say, oh my gosh, we're going vegan. And a lot of it was health. I have in my family hypercholesteremia, or however you pronounce it. I lost my dad and a sister to heart attacks. We all have, predisposition to high cholesterol. And the only way I seem to be able to keep it in check is to eat plants with lots of fiber in them and not get into something that doesn't, like even the chicken and the fish seems to, and dairy bothers me. So, so there was the health aspect, and then there's the, if you're around the animal farms like I was, doing water quality tests and things like that, and you see where modern agriculture is going, it's just horrifying. Even the way we're breeding the chickens, so they live in pain. They can hardly walk around, and they break their legs just spontaneously.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. Yeah.
Oh, it's grotesque. It's just absolutely grotesque. So, so I like chicken, or I did 20 years ago, and even Jack LaLanne ate it. But now, I'm more into the mycelium-based chicken. There's this company, Quorn, Quorn, that makes chicken patties, spicy chicken patties out of mycelium, the roots of mushrooms, and it's has a very high protein digestibility score, which you would like, and has fiber, including the same kind of fiber that oats has, beta glucans and water-soluble fiber and so on. So I just think, as an earth scientist, it's our destiny. We're gonna go plant-based one way or the other because we will have to.
We'll have to. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
So anyway, it's great talking. Love the interview. I'll let you know when I post it. I'm actually working on an episode on protein, and you'll be part of that episode, part of the interview, and then the whole interview will go up, edited, of course. Will go up in a week or so, something like that.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was great. It was great talking to you. I've been watching all the videos. I haven't gone through all the list, but I will pretty soon, because I'm doing like every day a couple of videos. I'm loving it.
Okay.
It was really honored to get invited to chat with you. So thank you very much.
I didn't know if anybody would watch these videos, to tell you the truth, and because I don't have a nutrition background, I just thought, who am I to do this? But I tried to take it. I had a friend in electronics, Walt Mossberg, who worked for the Wall Street Journal, and he was a political reporter, and he came into reviewing electronics, and he thought, well, who am I, why are people going to believe me? But he became the greatest reviewer there was, and the way that he did it is to say, I'm going to review it as a person who isn't an admirer of the tech companies or a deep expert. I'm going to review it as a consumer and relate my experience. And that's the way I'm doing it here. I'm not trying to be the expert. I'm trying to draw in the experts and relate our experience in trying to do this, because it's an effort to try to change from being an omnivore and get over your craving for baby back ribs with barbecue sauce.
But I think that's the best approach, actually, because those are the kind of questions that people can relate to, right? If it was to be like a chat between two nutrition experts, would be boring, would be very sciencey, and would probably annoy people who would be at first interested in the topic. So those are the relevant questions, actually.
I was going to interrupt this interview a couple of times to define things like anabolic. They won't know what that word is, and acute response and things like that. I'll just interject my 2 bits in those little sections just to make sure.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. I know. You're a scientist. I know it. These words are just second nature to you. So, all right. Thank you so much. We'll be in touch.
Thank you. Keep in touch.
Okay. Thanks a lot.